Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Roberts, Head of Investor Relations and Communications at Actinogen Medical, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this morning's presentation about our capital raising that we announced to the ASX this morning. This session should last about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on the number of questions. And our speakers here with me this morning, you can see on screen, CEO Stephen Gourlay, excuse me, and CFO Will Souter. Now, this is our standard disclaimer slide. This morning's presentation will contain forward-looking statements, and I'm not going to read out this slide, obviously, but you can look at it in this morning's announcement slide pack and any time in any of our presentations on our website. Some quick housekeeping. This is you can ask a question at any time. We'll probably leave them for the end to answer, but you can submit a question any time. Just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, type in your question, and then hit enter or the send icon. We may group like questions to answer, and look, if we run out of time and there's still questions, we'll get back to you via email or publish something on our website. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to our new CFO, Will.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here, and thanks for the introduction. This is my first time appearing in a webinar for Actinogen since starting with the company at the beginning of February. I'm at that kind of first 100 days point nearly, and it's been a really interesting and exciting journey. And I think what I've experienced since joining has really, borne out the reasons for joining the company in the first place, which, includes a couple of critical things. I think the team is fundamental that Steve leads and has put together and built out over the last 3 years since he started with Actinogen. And I think that's, it's really a blue chip team in a relatively small company. So that was one of the key reasons for joining, and I've certainly experienced that. I think the second thing is the stage that the company's at. 2 very important and substantial phase 2 trials with, in a drug development context, results just around the corner. So building on 10 years of data. And I think importantly, when I really got into the nuts and bolts of the design of these trials and the way that Steve's put those together with his team, prior to me joining, I was impressed by the amount of rigor and amount of data behind the clinical trial design that I think really de-risks the potential outcomes. And Steve will talk some more about that when he updates everyone on where we're at with both of those trials. And I think the third thing is a function of those two, which is the valuation at the moment doesn't reflect the potential of the company and the upside that I saw in it then that I see now. And I think, if you look at comparables, you look at transactions, you look at other companies trading in other markets, with this sort of data, we're significantly undervalued relative to them. So there's a real skew to the upside. So fantastic to be here and great to talk today about a major milestone event. We have raised up to $8 million. We're announcing today an up to $8.9 million capital raising. Just to take a step back in terms of where the company's at currently, we've got just over 2.3 billion shares on issue, which gives us a market cap around $80 million. We have 194 million unlisted options with a 3.75 cent exercise price on issue. Those relate to the rights issue that was done in 2023. And we have had some option conversions as a result of the price moving through that conversion price. So that's been helpful, and hopefully will continue to be helpful with additional funding as we move forward. Steve will update you some more on the IP and the real assets of the company around the Xanamem molecule and where that's at. But in terms of our other key balance sheet items, 6.3 million in cash at the end of the quarter, and no debt. When combined with the capital raising we're announcing today and our significant accrual in relation to R&D expenditure that should flow through to a substantial rebate later in the year, puts us in a very strong balance sheet position and gives us runway right through to the back end of 2025. Just a little bit more about the offer itself. It's a $5 million placement that we're announcing today to institutional and sophisticated investors. So that's 200 million shares at 2.5 cents per share. And that's done. So the funds will be in next week for that. There's a rights issue to enable shareholders to participate on the same terms as the new placee shareholders for up to 155 million new shares at 2.5 cents for a total of $3.9 million. The options that are attaching to all of the new shares being issued as part of the placement and the rights issue are being issued on a 1-for-2 basis at 5 cents per share and with an expiry at the end of May in 2027. So it's an up round in the overall context of things, with the options being 100% out of the money and the price being at 2.5 cents on an expanded capital base. The 2.5 cent price represents a 21% discount to the 30-day VWAP, so we think that's a fair place to position it and encourages people to participate in the funding. The rights issue, as I say, is a 1-for-15. Really important for shareholders to understand, because we're doing a placement today as well. If people want to maintain their overall equity position in the company, then they should take up their entitlements, but they should also participate in a top-up offer that's available to all shareholders under the entitlements issue. What that means is, and the prospectus will detail more information about that, but you simply need to bid the amount of shares you want, pay the money into the subscription account that will be detailed in the prospectus for the amount of shares that you want. And if that exceeds your entitlement offer and there's sufficient capacity available, then you will receive more than your entitlement under that top-up offer. If after taking all of that into account, we have excess demand, then the top-up offer, the top-up will be reduced pro rata. If we don't have enough demand to fill the entire rights issue, then we will place out the balance. So we're confident of getting to the full 3.9 million with that structure in place. And as I say, make sure you read the prospectus that'll be coming out on the 15th of May. The directors have all committed to take up their rights, and Steve himself is putting in another $120,000, which I think is a very strong endorsement and brings his commitment to the company to, in terms of cash in, to close to $1 million. And as I say, if you're not a shareholder yet, then you can still get on the record to participate in the rights issue, with the record date being Friday the 10th of May. So just to reiterate, the point of the fundraising is to really make the balance sheet robust and take us all the way through to the back end of 2025, which is beyond both critical milestones in terms of trial readouts. So the first being the XANA SID, a cognitive impairment and depression trial that will read out in Q3, and the XANA May phase 2b cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's trial reading out with an interim readout in mid-2025. I guess two more things to add in terms of the balance sheet. I think this also provides us with significant a buffer later in the year, which helps us with discussions with potential partners. So we have the flexibility to continue on our own all the way through the back end of 2025, but can also expand our discussions with partners and potential industry partners for funding, knowing that we can take a deal if it's in shareholders' interests, but keep going on our own if we think there's a better chance of increasing shareholder value by seeing our way through to that interim readout. The other thing, just a quick point on cash burn. People obviously have seen the quarterlies. We've been running at around 5 million a quarter for the last couple of quarters. That's because we've been running the two trials concurrently. As the XANA SID trial concludes, then that cash burn will step down as we move through into the second half of the calendar year. And so the combination of cash on hand, the capital raising, and the R&D rebate, together with that step down in the overall cash burn, gives us significant confidence in our runway right out to the back of 2025. I will now hand over to Steve to take you through a little bit more on the assets of the company and where the trials are at.
Thanks, Will. So I'm going to start with a few slides that before we get to the trials and emphasize the importance of the assets that the company has created. Obviously, we're now on our 8th clinical trial, so the clinical data is incredibly important. Nearly treated a little bit less than 400 people. We don't have any serious adverse events related to XanaMem therapy at all, so a very strong safety profile and an easy-to-use molecule. We've also created a very strong patent portfolio. In the neurodegeneration space, there are certainly some companies that have dusted off old molecules that don't even have what we call composition of matter, or the chemical formula patent that is the ultimate in protecting against competition and giving you market exclusivity. So our patent has been granted in all jurisdictions. It goes to 2031 with 5-year extensions in most markets, giving 12 years market exclusivity. Excuse me, from today. But importantly, we've extended the patent portfolio significantly with other types of patents called method of use patents, for example, for depression, patient selection, and also manufacturing and formulation to prevent future competition in later years. And the latest patent publication teaches the use of the blood biomarker p-tau for the selection of patients for Xanamem treatment in Alzheimer's disease. This is very important because this is exactly how we are selecting patients for our phase 2b study, Xanamem, that is ongoing currently, and is the way the new guidelines for Alzheimer's disease and the whole world is moving away from expensive PET scans to identify amyloid in the brains of people with Alzheimer's to this blood biomarker p-tau. Next slide. I also wanted to mention some deal making in the space. Neuroscience is having a bit of a renaissance, in part because understanding the biology of things of schizophrenia and depression, and new treatments that are coming on the market with some effectiveness have really driven some interesting deal making, and the same for Alzheimer's disease. Certainly the success, even though it's modest, of the anti-amyloid antibodies has led to the belief that neurodegeneration finally can be treated, and that's led to a flurry of interest from big pharma companies. And just to draw attention to, in the red box, 2 big deals were done late last year for schizophrenia assets in phase 2 and phase 3. One of those was an acquisition for $14 billion, the other for $8.7 billion. So big pharma is willing to pay for good-looking mid to late stage assets in the neuropsychiatry space, and schizophrenia certainly. And then in the ovals, I've outlined a few deals for Alzheimer's drugs where you see the upfront payments of 100 million, or in one case, which was a later deal, 700 million. But the big biobucks in the second or lower oval, around the 2 billion mark, shows you what these assets have been valued at in the last couple of years by larger pharma companies. So we have open lines of communication with all of the companies interested in neuroscience, and many of them are eagerly awaiting the phase 2A results from our Xanacid cognitive impairment and depression trial. Next slide. And very importantly, as Will mentioned, we have a great fully fledged and experienced team, as well as a deeply experienced board of directors. And so I won't dwell on this, but just to point out that Dana Hilt, in particular, who's in the US, is a very experienced neurologist and neuroscience investigator. And he has been with the company as an advisor and then a CMO for the last 2.5 years, and has been a very important person in driving our engagement, not just with investigators and in designing the clinical trials, but also in liaising with potential partners. Next slide. So what are we doing with Xanamem? What are we trying to do? So this slide just points out that for depression, in blue, we're trying to develop a rapidly acting oral therapy with dual action on both cognitive impairment and depression. These 2 things go along hand in hand in most patients with depression. And for Alzheimer's disease, we're also doing a dual action in the sense that we're trying to enhance cognition in people who have Alzheimer's disease, as well as modifying the time course of their disease symptoms and hopefully the underlying disease, as would be suggested by the preclinical work. Next slide. And these profiles potentially translate into large market opportunities. The total market size of the Alzheimer's disease market can be estimated around the 14 billion, could easily be larger, depending on whether or not molecules like Xanamem are successful and relatively easy and safe to use. We estimate that we get a significant chunk of that, assuming Xanamem is successful and gets on the market as a safe and effective, potentially disease-modifying therapy. For depression, it is a much more competitive market, similar size to Alzheimer's, interestingly, but there are certainly a lot of different molecules out there. But we believe that there's very much a valuable niche for a molecule such as Xanamem, that has an effect on both improving foggy thinking as well as depression itself, and estimates in the billions for peak sales as well. Next slide, please. So next, I'll talk a little bit about the science and the trials, and many of you have seen these slides before, so I won't dwell too much on these. So as a reminder, our molecule is a brain-penetrant 11-beta-HSD1 small molecule inhibitor, and the idea is that it reduces brain tissue cortisol by stopping this enzyme from synthesizing active cortisol in brain tissue, including in microglia, which are the sort of the white cells of the brain. It has the potential to be cognitively enhancing, and we've shown that in a couple of trials in healthy older volunteers already, and that will be the primary endpoint in the depression trial that we're doing currently. It's suggestive that it may be disease modifying based on animal studies, and certainly our own analysis of patients with mild Alzheimer's suggests that may be so. And it may well have antidepressant effects, and there's a very good rationale for that as well. So essentially at this stage, based on mouse experimental studies, human brain cortisol levels, which are elevated in depression and Alzheimer's disease, our own clinical trials, there's a lot of validation for our target cortisol for the treatment of Alzheimer's and to a certain extent, depression. Next. And this slide, just to reprise, is one of the reasons our molecule is so unique. And this is one of the reasons I took the job at the company. This is a PET scan showing on the left the green and gold areas where the tracer that binds to 11-beta-HSD1 is binding. And on the right, after 7 days of therapy with 5, 10, or 20 milligrams, you see near complete prevention of binding of this tracer by Xanamem occupying the target. And this shows that the drug gets into the brain, and not just that, but it gets into the brain and inhibits the target sufficiently, well over 60 to 80% in all regions of the brain, to do the job we need it to do, which is to improve cognition and hopefully modify disease. And this validates the 10 milligram dose we're using in our efficacy trials and the dose that was used previously in the phase 2A study in mild Alzheimer's disease. Nobody else has got these kind of data for a drug that targets 11-beta-HSD1. Next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about the depression program. We successfully enrolled slightly more than our target, originally 160. We enrolled 167 patients here in Australia and in the US, in the UK, and results are due early in Q3 of this year, so just a few months away. Next slide. And just a little reminder of the rationale for why cortisol is important in depression. Cortisol levels are associated with severe melancholic depression. There are a number of reports showing higher brain fluid cortisol levels in depressed patients. A lot of patients have foggy thinking, which often persists during remission despite depression improving. And then interestingly, if you tweak the cortisol system with a drug called mifepristone, it has shown some activity in psychotic depression, and that is a pretty interesting finding. But that drug's not safe enough to be used as a routine antidepressant. And a meta-analysis certainly suggested that cortisol is a very interesting target. But most importantly, in the pink box, our drug has already shown improved attention and working memory with the Cogstate computerized testing in 2 independent placebo-controlled trials in healthy volunteers. So that's a very good validation that we can improve human cognition in patients and in healthy volunteers as well. So to the next slide. So the study we designed is a very standard, industry standard phase 2A study, excuse me, 10 milligrams versus placebo over a 6-week treatment period and 4 weeks of follow-up. And the primary endpoint is the Cogstate computerized test battery we call the attention composite. And this measures attention and working memory. Attention and working memory is very important in all sorts of cognition. Most of you have probably driven around the corner and not remembered how you did that because you were thinking about something else. It's that focus, that attention and working memory, that is the key to most of cognition. The secondary endpoint is the MADRS depression rating scale, which is a very common regulatory endpoint used to approve antidepressants. We'll be measuring executive function and episodic memory function for cognition, as well as a number of different responder variables. Next slide. So to make sure that the data for this trial was going well and that nothing strange was happening, we have reviewed the overall data in a pooled or blinded manner. What this means is we haven't decoded who got 10 milligrams or who got placebo. We're just looking at all of the data pooled to make sure everything looks good. We also are doing this, so we used 148 participants. Part of the reason to do this is to make sure that the enrollment in each country looked similar and that the performance of the test was looking similar, and that no one clinical site, particularly the high enrolling sites, had strange results that were out of line with the rest of the program. Very importantly, no one in the company or in the trial at all, anywhere in any sites, knows who received which treatment, and you cannot directly evaluate Xanamem treatment effect from these kind of data. And as a reminder, the attention composite is the computerized reaction time tests for the primary endpoint, and the key secondary endpoint is the MADRS scale. And we just looked at the raw data. So to the next slide. So our assessment of data quality found no concerning trends by country or clinical site, which is reassuring. And very importantly, the clinical safety profile remains excellent, with no serious adverse events related to Xanamem. Interestingly, improvement was seen in all 3 computerized tests that make up the primary endpoint of the attention composite. Previously, there were a number of publications and our own work in healthy volunteer studies that showed in one of our studies, the placebo got worse, in another, it's improved very slightly. Others have published on depression where there was no improvement over a 12-week period. But we are seeing overall in the pooled data some improvement in the order of 30% of a baseline standard deviation, which is considered clinically significant in the field of cognition. So this is an encouraging observation, but not definitive by any means. That requires the unblinding of the code, and those results will be early in Q3 this year. For the MADRS depression score, there's a 32% change from baseline, and that's an improvement, which is in the range reported for both active and placebo groups in prior trials of depression. This is a subjective interview endpoint. It is typically you have between 20 and 40% improvement in placebo groups in depression trials. So it is good that it's all going in the right direction. But again, whether a treatment effect is there will require unblinding and the final results. So just to summarize, we did a data quality check. The data are moving in the right direction. There is improvement in the primary endpoint and the key secondary endpoint of depression. And we look forward to unblinding the results and reporting those to you in the very near future. Next slide. And then secondly, to the Alzheimer's program, where the next milestone will be in mid-2025 with the interim analysis of 100 patients. The next slide. The context for our program is that the new antibodies like donanemab, shown in orange there, are being approved by the FDA. They are very modestly effective. And in this slide, we show over an 18-month period in the dotted line, the placebo group decline of 2.5 points from a baseline of about 4 points, a change of 2.5 over that 18-month period. And only a very slight benefit of donanemab shown there in the solid line. So about a 1.7 decrease. So this is clinically significant in the sense that nothing else has ever been shown to modify and slow the course of disease before these antibodies to amyloid. But above the solid orange line, you see the huge area of unmet medical need, because ideally patients would be on the green line, where they're identified as having some early memory impairment and would take, hopefully, in the future, Xanamem and be stabilized and not worsen further. So drugs targeting other mechanisms other than amyloid are clearly needed, and nearly 80% of all of the efforts around the world these days are in non-amyloid, non-tau protein targets. Next. So our own data for Xanamem is very encouraging. So we went back and looked at biomarker-positive patients with elevated plasma p-tau in the previous phase 2A study. And in those biomarker positive patients, we found quite a big treatment effect of the drug shown in blue versus the more rapid progression of placebo in gray. The clinical effect size measured by something called a Cohen's d, or it's a percent of a standard deviation, was 0.4 or 40%. And the absolute difference was much larger than has been seen with antibodies at a week 12 time point. So this is very encouraging. We used this data set to help simulate the phase 2b trial that is now ongoing. Next slide. We also looked at cognition in this analysis, and on the left, you see the high p-tau biomarker group that were shown in the previous graph. And here we see a trend towards Xanamem preserving cognition as the placebo group gets worse, and the Xanamem group does not really. And on the right, in the lower p-tau biomarker group, probably without true Alzheimer's disease in most cases, we saw Xanamem improving cognition a little bit, or a trend towards that versus placebo. So taken together, this is all consistent with all of our data, suggesting Xanamem is potentially a cognitive enhancer and a disease modifier. Next slide. And the design of, just quickly, excuse me, the design of the Xanamem phase 2b study, which has commenced here in Australia, is a double-blind randomized trial, 10 milligrams versus placebo. Over a much longer period than the Xanacid trial. This is 36 weeks. And these are in patients who are p-tau biomarker positive, have mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease on clinical criteria. The primary endpoint is the test battery of cognition using 7 merged measures. And the key secondary endpoint is the CDR sum of boxes, which is the endpoint I showed you in the previous analysis. And importantly, an activities of daily living scale, which measures things like how easily you can use an iPhone and your normal activities of daily living. So we've commenced enrollment at up to 15 Australian sites. We'll do the interim analysis when 100 people have completed, and we have plans to add US sites as soon as feasible. So to the next slide. So just coming to the end of the presentation here. So we've kicked a few goals already this year. We published our human PET study in a peer-reviewed journal of Alzheimer's disease, which is great. The UK authorities gave us a type of breakthrough designation, which means they believe our program is of significant merit for patients in the future, called the UK Innovation Passport. We treated our first Alzheimer's patient, and of course, we achieved full enrollment of the cognition and depression study. And so I won't dwell on this one. We have an important set of work ahead of us, and we look forward to implementing a number of initiatives as we move forward. To the next slide. And so with that, I'm not going to talk right the way through this company highlights, but we'll put this up during the Q&A. And I'll actually hand back at this point to Michael Roberts to go over the Q&A method.
Thanks, Steve. Just a reminder to everyone. In fact, I can see a couple of questions there already, so we'll get to those. But just a reminder to everyone: click on the Q&A icon, type your question, and send it to us. Now, Steve, there's someone. People are allowed to ask anonymous questions. There's one here. Is there a reason why you wouldn't wait for results in Q3 before doing a capital raise?
I'm happy to jump in on that one if you like. I mean, I think
Sure.
there's a couple of key points, and if you want to add, please do. But I think for companies, and obviously I'm relatively new to the company, for companies that are like Actinogen and at this stage of their development and where their entire focus is on R&D, clinical trial activity, and spending money to bring an asset to potential commercialization, in my view, the market values you on 2 things. The first is the potential of that asset and what your program looks like and your ability to execute on it, but it's the asset itself, so Xanamem, the molecule. And secondly, and importantly, your liquidity and your runway, because if people have a perception that you're going to be raising money or that you aren't going to make it, then they write you down and your valuation goes down. So it's important to always maintain confidence in both of those aspects. There were ways for us to continue to fund the company and manage our way through to the other side of the depression results, and relatively easily we could do that. But if the impact of that is that people don't have confidence in that second aspect, our liquidity, then the valuation will get sold down anyway, which puts us in a much weaker position to raise bigger amounts of equity in the future. And also it makes it more difficult to have robust partnership discussions with much more substantial counterparties. So this is a top-up raise to take that issue off the table.
Thanks, Will. And Michael, could you just go back to one slide for the summary, just in case people have questions?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Steve. Yeah, I'll do that. Just one moment. Probably better than sitting on the Q&A slide. Sorry.
That's Brendan asked, do the US patents for composition of matter have a 5-year extension right? Yes, they do. So the market exclusivity extensions are pretty universal across the major markets of the US. Europe sometimes is even longer. China is implementing, to our knowledge, if you get China approved at the same time, you can get some extension of market exclusivity there. So in Australia, certainly 5 years. So really all of the major markets. There are a couple of exceptions like India, where that's not true. But in most places, yes. There's another question from Alan. Why are the options 5 cents rather than 3.75 cents? Alan's, we consider this to be somewhat of an up round compared to the round, the rights issue done last year. This is the options mature somewhat later than the previous options. And we think the 5 cents is a better number to recognize the likely value of those options at the time.
Just no more questions for the moment, but we might just wait if there's to see if there's any others from people online. We are reaching the end of our sort of estimated time for the session, but not sure, Steve.
Well, Michael, perhaps while we just wait to see if there's any other questions, I can just reiterate the key thing for shareholders. Hopefully there are others who are not shareholders yet out there, and they can become shareholders before the record date if they'd like to participate in the rights issue. But the key thing for people to do now is to wait until the prospectus goes live, which I think will be the 15th of May. There's more detail in the announcement released today about the timetable. And then during that 2-week period, follow the process outlined in the prospectus, obviously having regard to the detail of the prospectus to make your application. And just to reiterate, you can apply for more than your entitlement offer. You can apply for the top-up offer as well. So think about how many shares you would like to buy, and then follow the process, simply pay the money, and then you will be in the process. Just want to make sure people understand that, because that's a key takeaway from today.
Yeah. And Michael, just here we've got a question from Michael.
Mike, not me.
So improvements seen in all 3 computerized tests. How much confidence can be drawn from this, given the trial results to be positive? So, Michael, this is a really important question. So thank you for asking it, because I don't want to. We're not trying to oversell these data. What these data show us is that, as I mentioned, safety is going really well. The quality of the efficacy data is behaving itself. Patients are not getting worse. They're not standing still, or their measurements are not flat. So in other words, we've excluded people getting worse or not improving, and we've shown that overall people are improving. So while this is encouraging, you cannot, as I said earlier, directly infer Xanamem efficacy from these kind of data. But it is good news in the sense that safety is good, the data quality is good, and everything is moving in the right direction.
There's a few more questions coming, Steve. I'm not sure whether you can see those.
I'll just pull those up. Thank you. Anonymous said, do you see a registrational trial for either drug candidate following delivery of data? Great question. Yes, on one of the previous slides where we show the sort of planned series of next trials, we do anticipate the phase 2B that we're currently doing. We're doing it with the to-be-marketed formulation of tablets. This is for the Xanamem trial for Alzheimer's disease. it potentially could be a registrational trial if it was combined with the data from at least one other trial. And so for depression, the next trial would be a phase 2b trial, similarly positioned potentially as one of 2 or 3 pivotal trials. Often in depression, 3 trials are done. But yes, the registrational trials, we very much have the finish line in mind. It's really important, even though we would like to have partnerships in place to help support both the clinical trial program and, of course, the finances for that in the future. It is very important that we have a fully fledged plan and product development pathway to share with those partners and to co-develop. And so that is absolutely the plan. So we have those registrational trials firmly in mind. Josh,
Steve, sorry, I was just going to say,
go
I'll
ahead.
take the next one if you like. So
Sure.
there's a question about how shareholders can maintain their current equity position in the company. I realise it's difficult to divide by 2.3 billion, so maybe I can give you a shortcut, which is we're raising 5 million in the placement and 3.9 million in the rights issue. So the ratio works out to roughly, if you subscribe for roughly 2.3 times your entitlement, that will see you stay whole relative to the placees. Now, that obviously assumes that the rights issue is taken up in full. But as a rule of thumb, a bit over 2 times your entitlement should see you maintain your equity position.
Thank you, Will. Anonymous asked, would you consider a schizophrenia trial upon success of current trials? So, yeah, great question. Yeah, based on the data we've created to date, we do believe that the current depression trial should show a positive outcome on the cognitive endpoints. And so this has a direct read through to Alzheimer's disease, of course, but also to schizophrenia, where cognitive impairment is often in the order of 1.5 standard deviations or about 15 IQ points. It's actually quite profound. And there really are no drugs available that adequately treat that. Now, schizophrenia trials are quite difficult to do, particularly for an oral therapy. So, but yes, we would certainly consider schizophrenia as an important unmet medical need where Xanamem could be of important value for patients. Charles asked, would Xanamem and Xanacid be partnered separately? So this brings up, Charles, thank you for the question. It brings up a really good question. So generally speaking, assuming that you don't have a different formulation for one disease versus another, you really need to partner the molecule and the program to one or more partners on a geographic basis, but you can't really split the different diseases. So, for example, it'd be very unlikely we would partner Alzheimer's with one company and depression with another. It would almost certainly need to be companies that were interested in both, but could be potentially, a regional China and an Asian deal, but combined with a European deal, for example, and we could keep the American rights. There are very many different ways it could be put together, but splitting the indications or the diseases, so-called, very unlikely to be done. Fortunately, there's lots of organizations that are interested in both neuropsychiatry and neurodegeneration. And so there is a fairly robust universe of potential partners who would be interested in both.
Okay, that seems to be it for questions from the audience. You do have a moment. I just wanted to, Steve, just move to the through the appendix slides here to our contact details, because if there's any follow-up questions or any questions at any time, we're very happy to receive your questions, and we'll do our very best to answer them for you. If there's no others, given that it's 11:40, not sure, Steve, whether you have any, or Will, any wrap-up points to make, that we might conclude the session here.
No, I think we've had a
All done.
good discussion, Michael.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your attendance. We really appreciate it, and and reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.